54%. That's how much European gas prices jumped in a single morning. Not over a week, not over a month, one morning. And here's the thing. No pipeline exploded. No war reached European soil. No natural disaster wiped out a refinery. All that happened was Qatar made a phone call and turned off a valve. And in doing so, it just triggered what analysts are already calling the single most consequential energy event since 1973. Maybe bigger. Let's actually put that number in your hands for a second. 20% of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply gone. Not disrupted, not delayed, shut down deliberately by one country from one facility. The Ras Laffan LNG plant in Qatar, the largest LNG export terminal on the face of this planet, is not producing. And the man who runs Qatar Energy did not do this because drones forced him to. He did this because he chose to. That distinction is everything in this story. Because here's what the headlines are missing. 2 Iranian drones hit Qatar. One hit a water tank at a power plant in Masayid. One struck an energy facility at Ras Laffan. The physical damage was, and every analyst who looked at this agreed, limited. Qatar's infrastructure was not crippled. Qatar's production capability was not destroyed. Qatar looked at 2 drone strikes, assessed the situation, and decided to halt the largest LNG export operation in human history. Not because it had to, because it wanted leverage. And what it got was the most powerful economic weapon deployed in this conflict so far. Now, before we go further, do you understand what Ras Laffan actually is? Because I want you to feel the scale of this before we go anywhere else. This facility supplies energy to over 120 countries. 120. It is not a regional supplier. It is not a significant player. It is the backbone of global LNG. Somewhere between Europe heating its homes in winter and Asia keeping its factories running, Qatar sits at the center of that equation. And right now, that center is dark. Bloomberg called the production halt unprecedented. That word gets thrown around a lot in financial journalism. Here it is completely accurate. Nothing like this has happened in the modern LNG era. Not once. Now let's talk about 2022 for a second, because that's the reference point most people jump to when they hear energy crisis. Russia cut off roughly 80 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe. The continent scrambled. Governments fast-tracked emergency LNG terminals. Germany built infrastructure in months that was supposed to take years. It was painful. It was expensive. It reshaped European energy policy in real time. And analysts at the time called it the worst energy disruption since 1973. Qatar's Ras Laffan handles up to 120 billion cubic meters annually. Anne-Sophie Corbeau at Columbia University said it directly. The volume at stake here is larger than the 2022 Russia crisis. Not comparable to it, larger than it. So if 2022 broke records and rewrote energy policy across an entire continent, what word do we use for this? Here's where it gets worse. And I know you're thinking, how does it get worse? But stay with me, because this next part is what's keeping energy ministers up at night across 3 continents right now. Gregory Brew at the Eurasia Group flagged something that should alarm anyone paying attention. Europe is heading into spring, which should be the comfortable period, the low-demand season, the window where storage refills before next winter, with gas storage sitting below 30%. That is 10 percentage points lower than this point last year. 10 points. In energy terms, that is not a rounding error. That is a structural vulnerability. Europe was already walking into this crisis carrying less than it needed. And now 20% of global LNG supply just went offline. So the obvious question is, can anyone fill the gap? Can the U.S. step in and redirect supply? Can other producers ramp up? The answer, and this is not speculation, this is operational reality, no. American LNG export terminals are running at 100% capacity right now. There is no spare production sitting in a warehouse somewhere. You cannot call up an LNG terminal and ask it to produce 40% more next Tuesday. Replacement supply requires infrastructure, new projects, new terminals, things that take years to build and don't exist yet. The global LNG system has no slack in it. Qatar's exit from the market doesn't create a gap that competitors rush to fill. It creates a hole that nobody can plug. And you know what that means for ordinary people in Germany, France, Britain, Italy? It means heating bills go up, electricity bills go up, industrial output starts to slow. And here's the thing about those countries. They all have elections. They all have trade unions. They all have industrial lobbying groups. The moment energy prices spike, those mechanisms activate immediately, and every one of them starts generating pressure toward one destination, Washington, which is exactly what Qatar is counting on. Let me show you the chain that most coverage is skipping over, because the gas price spike is just the opening act. Natural gas heats industrial furnaces. Those furnaces produce steel. Gas also produces ammonia. Ammonia is the foundation of nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer is what keeps global crop yields at the level they are. So trace it forward. Gas prices up 54% this morning. Ammonia costs spike within weeks. Fertilizer costs follow. And then months from now, food prices climb. This did not start as a food crisis, but the clock is now running on one. The 1973 oil embargo didn't hit grocery stores overnight either, but it did. And the mechanism playing out right now is structurally identical. Think about that for a second. 2 drone strikes on Qatar, and we're talking about food prices 6 months from now. That is the cascade that the Financial Times source close to the Qatari government was describing when they used the phrase, and this phrase was chosen carefully, cascade of economic harm, not accidental disruption. Deliberate, sequential, calculated economic harm sent outward from one facility in the Qatari desert in every direction simultaneously. Now here's a layer of this story that is genuinely underreported. Ras Laffan is not just a Qatari government asset. Shell has equity in that facility. ExxonMobil has equity in it. Total Energies, ConocoPhillips, some of the largest energy companies on the planet have billions of dollars in production sitting completely idle right now. And those companies have boards, they have shareholders, they have government relationships across multiple continents. When major private energy corporations stop making money because a geopolitical conflict has shut down their most important production facility, they pick up the phone. And the phones they pick up connect to capitals that matter. At the same time, and this is the part where the geography of this crisis starts to feel genuinely suffocating, look at the maritime picture. The Strait of Hormuz is conditionally closed. Over 200 vessels are anchored and waiting. Maersk, the world's largest shipping company, has suspended transits through both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously. 2 maritime choke points, both disrupted at the same time. The Bab el-Mandeb disruption alone during the Houthi campaign was enough to spike global shipping costs significantly. This is both choke points together simultaneously on top of the LNG shutdown. The system is not under pressure in one place. It is under pressure everywhere at once. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Qatar is a small country. It has no large air force. It has no significant missile deterrent. It has no direct military leverage over any of the major powers involved in this conflict. So how does a country with no military muscle become one of the most consequential actors in a war it didn't start and doesn't want? Because it controls 20% of global LNG supply and had the strategic clarity to understand that this was more powerful than any weapon it could have pointed at anyone. Qatar cannot win a military confrontation. It doesn't need to. The target isn't Iran. The target isn't even the United States directly. The target is the energy bill sitting on a kitchen table in Munich, the heating invoice arriving in Birmingham, the electricity cost landing on a factory manager's desk in Lyon. Qatar's weapon is economic pain, delivered through its absence from the market rather than any direct action against anyone. Analyst Rob Geist-Pinfold at King's College London framed the Gulf state position with a clarity that cuts through everything else being said right now. His assessment: the Gulf countries hosting American bases are absorbing Iranian strikes, and they are absorbing the collateral consequences of a war that was designed and initiated elsewhere. His framing was direct. This is not their war. Iranian strategy is explicitly designed to make that reality as costly as possible for Gulf states, to drive up the price of proximity to this conflict until those governments start demanding an exit. Qatar's LNG shutdown is the economic translation of exactly that pressure. It is coercion by leverage, not through weapons, through energy markets. Now, I want to take you somewhere that almost nobody in this coverage is going because it is uncomfortable. Vladimir Putin called Qatar's Emir directly after the shutdown. He expressed hope for rapid de-escalation. That is the diplomatic language. Now, here's the reality underneath it. Russian gas, the gas that Europe spent 3 years in extraordinary political capital walking away from after the 2022 Ukraine invasion, is now economically attractive again, not theoretically attractive. Actually attractive, because when you remove 20% of global LNG supply from a market that was already running with no spare capacity, and you do it with no timeline for restoration, the economics of alternatives shift immediately. European governments that made painful, costly, politically difficult decisions to disentangle themselves from Russian energy are now sitting across the table from a situation where their storage is below 30%. Their alternative suppliers are maxed out, and the bills are climbing. Putin does not need to fire a single missile to benefit from this conflict. He needs to wait, and he is waiting. The reversal of 3 years of European energy realignment. undone not by Russian military action, not by Russian political pressure, but by a conflict in the Middle East that Russia had nothing to do with starting, is the strategic wild card sitting underneath everything else right now. So let's actually address the title directly. Is this worse than 1973? Here's the honest accounting. The 1973 oil embargo. Arab OPEC nations restricted supply to nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled. The Western world went into recession, gasoline rationing, industrial contraction. It permanently restructured global energy policy and created the strategic oil reserve systems that most major economies maintain to this day. It was the defining economic shock of its era. The structural differences now are what make the comparison not just valid, but arguably understated. In 1973, the United States was a major domestic oil producer and was partially insulated from what was happening. Today, U.S. LNG terminals are at 100% capacity and cannot offset what Qatar has removed from the market. In 1973, the global LNG market barely existed as a trading system. Europe and Asia were not dependent on it the way they are today. Today, LNG is the backbone of industrial energy for the most economically significant regions on the planet. In 1973, you had one choke point concern. Today, you have two maritime choke points disrupted simultaneously, compounding the supply problem with a logistics problem on top of it. And in 1973, there was spare capacity sitting in various parts of the global system that could be redirected. Right now, Gregory Brew's assessment is unambiguous. There is no spare capacity. The system was already tight before Qatar made its decision. 20% of global LNG offline. Storage in Europe below 30%. U.S. supply maxed out. Two maritime choke points closed. Private equity from four of the world's largest energy companies sitting idle. Food chain pressure building toward a 6-month horizon. Russian gas becoming attractive again across a continent that just spent 3 years trying to escape it. When you lay it out against the 1973 baseline, the arithmetic is not kind to the optimistic interpretation. And here's what none of the financial models or geopolitical frameworks fully capture. The psychological dimension of this. In 1973, ordinary people felt the crisis through gasoline lines. It was visible, tangible, daily. The crisis in front of us now is moving through systems that are less visible. LNG terminals, ammonia contracts, fertilizer pricing. Until it isn't invisible anymore, until it arrives on the heating bill, until it shows up at the supermarket. And by the time it's that visible, the cascade has been running for months. The questions that determine how this resolves are not military ones anymore. How long does Ras Laffan stay shut? That is the number one variable in this entire situation right now. Every day the facility stays offline is a multiplier on everything else. Does Europe convert rising energy pain into direct diplomatic pressure on Washington for a ceasefire? Do European governments facing domestic economic consequences decide that the cost of proximity to this conflict exceeds the political cost of breaking with the American position? Does Russia re-enter the European energy equation? And if it does, what does that mean for the entire post-2022 architecture that was built specifically to prevent that outcome? Can maritime traffic through Hormuz resume, and on whose timeline and whose terms? These are not hypotheticals sitting somewhere in the future. They are decisions being made right now, today, in government offices in Berlin and Paris and Brussels, in trading rooms in London and Singapore, in boardrooms where Shell and ExxonMobil executives are looking at production equity that isn't producing. This conflict started as a military campaign with military objectives. It has become an energy war. And in an energy war, the variables that determine outcomes are not missile inventories or air defense penetration rates. They are gas storage percentages in European countries with elections coming. They are shipping schedules through straits that are currently blocked. They are the patience thresholds of governments watching their domestic energy costs climb while their citizens start asking questions. Qatar does not have an air force. It does not have a missile program. It has Ras Laffan. And it turns out that in 2025, that is enough to move the entire world.